Under the brutal sun of the Libyan desert, an Italian brigade struggles for survival. After being separated from their division and running headlong into a minefield, the confused men find themselves encircled by a much better equipped force of British troops. The pleas for reinforcements on the radio only confirm that the rest of their division is in the same predicament, suppressed and rapidly running out of ammunition. The Italians decide to push forward, hoping to find a gap in the British lines. At the head of the column, the pointman shouts to his fellows. He sees something. The Italians' hearts swell with optimism, and they surge forward with renewed vigor. Maybe, just maybe, their prayers have been answered, and their comrades are coming to help break the encirclement. But as the silhouettes on the horizon come closer, the Italians see the jeeps and trucks their own army lacks. Instead of being swept up in some dramatic rescue, the Italians slump to the ground and wait to be taken prisoner. Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the armchair historian. You don't have to go very far into history message boards before you find jokes made at the expense of fascist Italy, manipulated images and parody songs lampooning Il Duce and his nation's military failures are all over the historical side of the web. While somewhat oversold, the pop historical idea of Italy as the Second World War's punching bag has some real-world support. In the military stakes, Italy was a distant third in the Axis Big Three. But simply writing the entire nation of Italy off as some kind of buffoon ignores a complex web of politics, logistics, and internal intrigues that conspired to clip the wings of this would-be heir to the Roman Empire. In this video, we will revisit one of our most popular episodes, looking past the memes to provide a broad look at the objective reasons Italy proved so ineffective during the Second World War. For all their numerous failings, the Italian military had one surprising area of expertise: cryptology. Both the Army and Navy maintained small but highly effective code-breaking operations, and were especially successful at decoding Royal Navy transmissions and U.S. military reports during the North Africa campaign. This brings us neatly to the sponsor of today's video, NordVPN, which promises to keep your data safe from any malicious actors. NordVPN now encompasses a whole suite of essential tools like NordPass for password security and NordLocker for encrypted cloud storage. Another recent addition is NordVPN's threat protection feature, which scans files for malware, warns you about malicious websites, and even blocks intrusive ads for the smoothest and safest browsing experience possible. All of this is in addition to standard features like region switching and the ability to bypass content restrictions to view historical content, no matter where you are. Support our channel and start enjoying free integrated anti-malware protection from NordVPN's new threat protection system today by signing up using the link in the description below or by visiting nordvpn.com/historypn. The Kingdom of Italy was roughly 61 years old when Benito Mussolini came to power. The Italian people had yet to form a true national identity with a stronger sense of identification with and loyalty to one's immediate neighbors and church than to a distant government in Rome. The disunified citizens of this young country were the clay from which Benito Mussolini intended to mold his new Roman Empire. Il Duce was determined to craft a fascist state, reaching from Gibraltar to the Parisian Gulf, and in pursuit of his vision of empire, he set about a campaign of military adventures in the lead-up to the Second World War that expanded Italy's imperial holdings and advanced the fascist cause in Europe at their own expense. These adventures, from the swift annexation of Albania to the brutal ethnic cleansing campaign in the deserts of Libya, were wastes of valuable resources for little gain. But of all of Italy's military ventures during the interwar period, It is the nation's involvement in the colonial war in Ethiopia and the Spanish Civil War that most notably exemplify the unnecessary expenditure of military resources and, at times, dissent over the unrealistic nature of Mussolini's aspirations. Il Duce had made no secret of his aspiration to conquer Ethiopia, believing that an imperialist success would unite the country behind him and provide Italy with access to the sea unfettered by foreign presence. Mussolini's Minister for Colonies, Emilio de Bono, received official orders in February 1934 to prepare offensive plans, and in December of that same year, Mussolini publicly ordered the conquest of Ethiopia. The timing seemed perfect, as most European powers were distracted by Nazi Germany's rearmament. However, as it spent 1935 preparing for war, the Italian military's shortcomings became clear. Marshal Pietro Badoglio, head of the Italian High Command, visited the staging grounds in Italian Eritrea and returned with a grim opinion. Italy was completely unprepared for an offensive war, and Badoglio further warned that a war in Ethiopia would prove a potentially fatal financial strain. Badoglio said as much in a meeting of the High Command in September 1934. His warnings were met with absolute indifference and indication of the discord amongst Italy's leadership. Il Duce had long ago decided on invading Ethiopia, which they did in October of 1935. De Bono was put in charge of the invasion and found himself at the head of an army under strain. Men and material were in short supply, and progress proved so slow that Mussolini replaced de Bono with Badoglio, who, remember, had been against the invasion. Under Badoglio, the Italians leveraged their superior weaponry and communications ability to improve the conditions on the ground, but ultimately resorted to deploying mustard gas to overcome Ethiopian troops and pacify civilians. These blatant violations of the Geneva Convention saw Italy placed under economic sanctions, which served to drive domestic support for both Mussolini and the invasion. While Italy would declare victory in 1937, they would face continuous insurrection until 1939, before ultimately losing Ethiopia to the British in 1941. Along with over 200,000 Italian soldiers taken prisoner. When civil war broke out in Spain in 1936, between left-wing Republicans and right-wing nationalists, Il Duce unilaterally committed Italy to Francisco Franco's nationalist cause. Mussolini intended to use intervention in Spain to cement fascist control over the Mediterranean, with him and Franco casting long shadows over the region. Like Germany, Italy sent the nationalists arms and men. But here is where things take a turn. So excited to support Franco was Mussolini that he had more than 70,000 Italian soldiers in Spain at the peak of his nation's involvement, and at times had more aircraft in Spain than the Spaniards did, consisting of 1/10 of the estimated numbers fighting for Francisco Franco's fascists. Italy had deployed more soldiers than any other nation in Spain on either side of the conflict. The Italian loss of life was estimated to be around 4,000 soldiers. Mussolini was exceptionally generous to his fascist ally, giving the Spaniards more than 600 planes, 150 tanks, 800 artillery pieces, 10,000 machine guns, and nearly 250,000 rifles. These were men and machinery that Italy could ill afford to lose. And though the Spanish Civil War proved a valuable training ground for Italian troops, the impact of the loss of material to Spain would last throughout the entire Second World War. With these pre-war conflicts and their effects on Italy understood, we must now turn to the key reason Italy even had the opportunity to be ineffective in the Second World War: their relationship to Nazi Germany. Although they had a rocky start to their relationship, Hitler averred his belief that he and Mussolini shared the destiny of saving Europe from democracy and Judeo-Bolshevism. In 1936, the Axis powers were born with the signing of the Rome-Berlin axis. United by fascism, bitterness over the end of the First World War, shared hatred of communists, Jews, and other outgroups, as well as their determination to conquer. Both dictators prepared for war against any who would oppose them. Concluding a military alliance in 1939, this pact of steel mandated that both Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy go to war against any nation the other attacked, and that they keep constant diplomatic contact to coordinate their effort. Hitler kept this promise as well as he'd kept every vow he'd made to the world. That is to say, he didn't. Without informing his ally, Hitler planned the invasions of Czechoslovakia and Poland, even stressing to German high command the importance of attacking before Mussolini discovered their plans. This subterfuge put Mussolini on edge, leaving him worried that Germany might next begin asserting dominance in the Balkans, which he regarded as falling within Italy's sphere of influence. When Poland was invaded in 1939, Italy was in no position to fight alongside Germany. Mussolini had confided in Hitler that Italy would not be ready to wage war until 1943. But Mussolini feared being absorbed by Germany if Italy did not take decisive military action. And though his advisors stayed his hand at first, the imminent fall of France in 1940 gave the deuce his opening. Thus, Italy plunged headfirst into a war even the bellicose deuce knew she was completely unprepared for. The leadership of Italy was not imbecilic and knew that they had to quite literally pick their battles. Better to be the hyena following Germany's lion, gorging themselves on Hitler's kill. The surest bet in mid-1940 was on Hitler next invading Great Britain, and the Soviet Union remaining out of matters thanks to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Besides, Hitler had promised to help the Italian economy, Fascist Italy's Achilles heel. Like their Axis partner Japan, Italy was reliant on foreign imports of raw materials, imports that were all but cut off during wartime. Unlike Germany, who had long prepared for wartime economic self-sufficiency, and had a strong industrial base, Italy was never prepared for a state of autarky, and lacked the industrial capabilities and raw materials to compensate for it. Before the war, Italy imported 9 million tons of coal to supplement their 1.5 to 4 million tons of domestic production, 2/3 of which was brought in by sea. When Italy entered the war alongside Germany, a British blockade did away with this seaborne coal, and Italy had to scramble to increase overland imports and domestic production. Italy's access to oil was likewise hindered, as their previous suppliers, the United States, Iran, and the Soviet Union, cut off their sales when war broke out. Italy found itself reliant on Romania to supplement its meager domestic oil production. But as the Eastern Front opened up in 1941, Germany monopolized Romania's oil, and while Italy did have access to mammoth stores of raw aluminum, their issues in fuel and power generation prevented them from exploiting this key resource to its fullest potential. Italy barely managed to produce 1/3 of the aluminum that Germany did throughout the war. The upshot of all of these troubles was a military apparatus without reliable access to fuel, and an overtaxed industrial sector prone to utter paralysis. Italy was already a tiny part of the world's industrial base, representing 3% of global industrial output, compared to Germany's 11%. This minuscule industrial capability was divided between producing goods for the domestic economy and producing weapons for the entire Axis war effort. Italy produced roughly 21% of Axis tanks, 25% of Axis fighter aircraft, and every type of combat ship needed by the Axis for seaborne operations. Germany relied heavily on Italy to build out Axis convoys in the Mediterranean. Italy, a small industrial producer, was called upon to not only outfit themselves, but to provide additional material for their Axis partners, a proposition they were simply not prepared for. Compounding these issues were the aimless nature of the Italian war effort and the endemic corruption of Italian business culture. Economic planners also completely rejected the idea of a streamlined production line or the standardization of parts, instead relying on isolated groups of skilled workers, painstakingly handcrafting small batches of largely obsolete weapons at a cripplingly slow pace. The problems in industrial production served only to further hinder Italy's ability to wage war. These production issues were not isolated to small arms production, however, and were plainly evident in the nation's inability to both manufacture a suitable number of tanks and generate designs that compared in quality to both their ally and their foes. Italian armored forces compared particularly poorly in both doctrine and equipment to their Allied counterparts. One such example would be the inability of Italian industries to produce enough welded or cast armor plating, and the mountainous Italian terrain discouraged the development of heavily armored vehicles in the first place. Therefore, the most commonly produced tracked vehicle in the Italian army was the Carovalosh CV-33 tankette, a tiny two-man armored vehicle that could be equipped with machine guns, anti-tank rifles, light cannons, or even flamethrowers. On paper, this was a versatile tank that could be easily built with Italy's limited industrial capacity and saw extensive use in Italy's colonial territory. In practice, the CV-33 was poetically named Casa di Morto, or Dead Man's Box, by its crews, who hated the flimsy armor and cramped interior. After the war, Allied observers would comment that the individual components of many Italian tanks were well engineered and reliable, showcasing a solid grasp of the technology needed for a successful modern vehicle. The problem was the total lack of cooperation between companies, leading to new ideas being viewed with suspicion and international deals being intentionally sabotaged for fear of competition. The single exception was found with the Italian Air Force, which successfully replaced their outdated air-cooled engines with licensed Daimler-Benz liquid-cooled engines in 1940. Newer Italian fighters like the Machi C-202 Folgare were noted for their excellent handling characteristics and remained competitive until 1943. Even after this point, the Reggiani Company was able to produce advanced aircraft like the RE 2005 Sagittario, which British aces considered superior to even the Spitfire and Bf-109. The issue lay with the numbers. Fewer than 60 Sagittarios were ever produced. As if comparatively subpar equipment were not bad enough, these inefficiencies would be compounded by severely strained logistics and inept decision-making on the part of Italian commanders, who were frequently at odds with their leader and each other. At the outbreak of war, the Regia Marina, the Italian Navy, only had 2 battleships. They had also not significantly incorporated radar and sonar technologies as the Royal Navy had done, which left them effectively blind to enemy approach at night or in poor weather. This would become a significant factor in losses of several battles, such as the Battle of Cape Matapan, where not a single Italian ship possessed radar capabilities. A notably poor strategic decision was the failure to take advantage of their close position to one of Britain's most geographically significant bases, Malta. Malta was the only Allied base between Gibraltar and Alexandria, and was not reinforced by the British due to their belief that they could not defend it from the Regia Aeronautica. The Italian Air Force. In the wake of the Battle of Taranto in November of 1940, when the Royal Navy disabled much of the Italian fleet there, Italian High Command became reluctant to attempt an amphibious takeover of the islands and opted to rely entirely on the Regia Aeronautica to bomb the islanders into submission. In March 1941, the raid on Cape Matapan by the Royal Navy badly damaged the Regia Marina's only operational modern battleship and sank 3 cruisers and 2 destroyers, while receiving almost no damage in return. Hindered by the resistance of their commanders in the wake of Taranto and Matapan, unwillingness to focus their efforts on convoy escorts, a lack of cover from the Regia Aeronautica, and perpetual fuel shortages, the Regia Marina failed to take advantage of its potential to cut the Mediterranean in half and ensure Axis supply lines to North Africa. Meanwhile, the invasion of Greece, which Mussolini intended to be a military triumph, was in reality a poorly planned assault on a prepared foe. The rushed invasion and aforementioned logistical and economic deficiencies hamstrung their efforts, and the Greeks were soon able to not only halt the Italian advance, but launch a counter-invasion into Italian Albania. Mussolini was forced to pull troops from North Africa to reinforce the fronts in Greece and Albania, making these withdrawals in the face of British attacks. The Italian High Command became monomaniacal, directing all of their efforts at salvaging the Balkan fronts. These efforts were undercut by Mussolini himself, who actively sought to undermine Badoglio, now the chief of the Italian Supreme General Staff, as he was apprehensive about the marshal's popularity. Badoglio, arguably one of Italy's more pragmatic commanders, was forced to resign as the scapegoat and replaced by Marshal Ugo Cavallaro, whose appointment was considered politically motivated and unjust in the eyes of other senior officers. The disaster of the Greek front only continued from there, from October 1940 to May 1941. 5 times more troops were sent to shore up Greece and Albania than were dispatched to counter the British in North Africa, along with 1.3 times more material. Additionally, this meant that the Regia Marina was more occupied with ferrying men and material to Albania and the Aegean than securing supply lines to North Africa. Italian efforts were not met with much success, as the rugged terrain and weather of Albania interfered with radio communication, leaving them unable to coordinate their forces over long distances. When it became clear that Italy could not bring the invasion to a successful conclusion on their own, Germany invaded Greece in April of 1941, and the Italian High Command finally turned their attention back to North Africa. The North African front serves as a perfect showcase of everything wrong with the way fascist Italy ran its military operation. The Italians invaded Egypt through Libya in September 1940 and experienced a catastrophic loss only a few months later during Britain's first large-scale military operation, Operation Compass. During Operation Compass, a Commonwealth and Free French force, numbering no more than 36,000, crushed the Italian 10th Army, a combined Italian-Libyan force of 150,000. Presiding over this disaster was Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, formerly considered one of the best Italian generals, but Graziani's experience had been earned against Italy's many colonial enemies, and he was left totally out of his depth when confronted by a modern European army. Despite a tremendous numerical advantage, Graziani quickly recognized his largely non-mechanized force could be easily outmaneuvered by the motorized British force, and with his supply lines already overstretched, he reluctantly decided to dig in and fortify at key defensible positions. But these strong points were strung out and incapable of supporting each other, so the British simply drove through the gaps and encircled them. These tactics enabled the British to use their full force of 36,000 men, 275 tanks, 120 guns, and 60 armored cars against 1 or 2 Italian positions at a time, often finding themselves encircled. Italian and Libyan troops surrendered in their thousands. By the end of the operation, the British had taken more than 138,000 prisoners, hundreds of tanks, thousands of guns, and numerous aircraft, whilst sustaining a few losses by comparison. The Italians' fortunes were briefly reversed by Hitler, who sent the newly formed Afrika Korps under Erwin Rommel to bail Mussolini out. The German intervention and subsequent moment of triumph, before the Axis was eventually driven back to Sicily, served to further highlight the Italians' deficiencies in both leadership and logistics. German forces comprised the minority of total forces throughout the entire North African campaign, showing that the insertion of capable German leadership played a key difference in the performance of the Italian army. Tactical prowess and a few German panzers can't solve logistical issues, however, and so the North African campaign was in many ways doomed from the start. Additionally, Italian disunity at home and misfortune in the field did not breed a strong fighting spirit in the Italians as a whole. While many Germans were convinced of the righteousness of their cause, the Italians' loyalty to home over nation and skepticism of central government prevented them from widely accepting such ideas. This, coupled with their string of military embarrassments, set the stage for the rapid Italian surrender before the end of the war. Unlike every other major power involved in the Second World War, Italy threw in the towel long before its capital was directly threatened. Londoners endured the Blitz, the Chinese even after Nanking fell, the Germans down to the rubble of Berlin, and the Russians even at the gates of Moscow. The people of Italy, however, were not so inclined to see their home destroyed to uphold their fascist government. When the United States and Britain invaded Sicily in July of 1943, the writing was on the wall for Il Duce. July 25th saw Mussolini stripped of military command, and the next day he was formally dismissed as Prime Minister before being imprisoned. Italy's military misfortune under Mussolini was not simply the result of incompetence, but of a lack of preparation, economic pressures, inferior weaponry, and feuding officers and bureaucrats. To reduce fascist Italy to the comic relief of the Axis powers forgets that they desired the conquest and stood for the same evils as Nazi Germany. They just weren't as unified as a force, and thus unable to enact their villainy on as large a scale as their ideological ally.